Thank you. Yamamalia, hello friends, and I've titled this presentation, which is a idiosyncratic journey through architecture, and hopefully you'll get a sense of the why. And as is customary in protocol, it's always important to acknowledge that we are indeed here on the unceded sovereign lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nation. Understanding that they've been the custodians of country for millennia, and they've certainly protected these lands and waterway for thousands upon thousands of years. And the way in which I've sort of organised this presentation is to, walk through a series of sort of key themes which sort of speak to my sort of journey and really give you a bit of a sense and understanding of some of the motivations and ideas that have really, stuck with me and really started to inform my practice. And the first one really is around identity. And I always like to start to acknowledge those trailblazers that have come before, particularly those elders and knowledge keepers who are no longer with us. And this is my parents here, and so I share a really interesting sort of blended cultural background. So through my late father, Bert Groves, who was an Aboriginal activist, he was born 6 years after Federation. He was there at the National Day of Mourning in 1938. He signed up as a soldier in the Second World War. He spent 10 years on the 67 referendum, which enabled Indigenous people to be counted as citizens in their own nation. He was an important Aboriginal activist and civil rights campaigner. And so much so, there are buildings named after him, streets named after him in our national capital. And so that's a legacy that I really sort of take on board in terms of his lineage and connection to this country. On my mother's side, they came over here in Australia after the Second World War from Germany. And so the sort of persecution has occurred on both sides, in as much as my mother's grandfather actually died in a concentration camp. And so they almost didn't quite make it, in that it was the only migrant ship to have actually sunk en route to Australia. So this is the legacy that I draw upon. And interestingly, after my father passed away when I was a small child, we actually married into a very well-known family, which traces back to the first colonial architect in Australia, Jefa Greenaway, who was sent over here, not of his own free will. He was caught for forgery as an architect, but somehow appeared on the $10 note. So by way of connection, my lineage traces back to the Walwong people of northwest New South Wales on the Liverpool Plains. And I also have connections to Dharawal, which is where I was born. I was born on Dharawal country, which is essentially first contact, Botany Bay, around that area. So there's a really interesting thread through history and time. And that really galvanised, the way I've sort of thought about practice. And identity is very much centred around my mode of practice. And so there is no part of this island continent that is devoid of memory and meaning. And so across this vast land, it has been felled, it's been poisoned, it's been desecrated. The bloodstain of Indigenous people are certainly scarred into the landscape. My father grew up on an Aboriginal mission where he was corralled into a part of the country where he had to seek permission in order to leave the country in which he was born. So this is part of the understanding of how we start to reveal those layers of history and memory of place. And so there was a very sort of, circuitous route into architecture in terms of the sort of discovery phase of why I thought architecture as an appropriate area of discipline to concentrate my efforts. And so it really started from that immediacy of mind to hand. So that ability to draw and to communicate has always been something that I've been interested in. My mother actually trained in fine arts and graphic design. My sister's an artist. My father was a very good draftsman. So it is embedded in the DNA in that regard. And it really started with understanding that penmanship and that draftsmanship and that ability to communicate graphically. And so through my journey, I started off actually as a technical draftsman. So I spent 3 years in a diploma to really hone those skills on how to draw. And back in the day, it was really pre-computer, so it was really that sort of manual dexterity of understanding how one thinks about light and colour and texture and tone. But also, I really was interested in the detail and understanding the tectonic exploration and how we actually really interrogate the how and how elements come together and how those junctions meet and how we think about the buildability. And so these really underscored, I guess, that pathway into understanding. And equally, the physical artefact and the three-dimensional craft was something that has really stuck with me. And so through my university days, I actually set up a practice to build architectural models for other architects. So I essentially was crafting and really thinking about form, but engaging with other practitioners and understanding the way in which they practice and the different modes of their design exploration was really, I guess, pivotal in terms of understanding some of these really important considerations. And having been benefited by travelling extensively globally, including going on a national Emerging Architectural Prize to Europe, the Dulux Study Tour. And so visiting a number of really important design cities in London, Copenhagen and Barcelona, we visited the office of 3XN, and they have a really compelling proposition where they've set up a separate entity called GXN, and that's really looking at material science and innovating and thinking about products and starting to think about our responsibility and obligations around the sustainability considerations of the elements that we use, knowing that we are very much working with finite resources. And so the model-making culture of these different cities was really apparent. Attending and visiting some major practices across these three cities, and it really spoke to me around the tactility, the materiality, the textures, the colours that we employ as part of the toolkit of architecture. And through this journey, and it's similar, I guess, in terms of one sort of interest in things like music, where I can be, listening to Chopin at one end and Nirvana at the other and the Beatles in the middle. My sort of exploration is quite eclectic in terms of trying to find a pathway into architecture. And so while I wasn't particularly interested in the postmodern era, which sort of germinated in the 80s and the 90s, I guess one of the sort of key elements that it sort of spoke to was this notion of complexity. And I guess the journey into architecture has really sort of started to interrogate that idea of paring it back to the essence, but also having layers of meaning where you start to shift from a sort of a one-liner, if you like. And so they're the sort of ideas that started to percolate in those early days. And certainly, I guess, the purity and the legibility and the clarity of the modernist era certainly left an imprint. And there was a time when I was very interested in the sort of the modernists, certainly the exemplars like Mies, really the detail and the refinement and that process of subtraction to really get back to the essence of the idea was something that really resonated with me. But equally, having visited some really, I guess, pivotal and really key projects like Sagrada Familia, and actually being there during construction and being taken through by the architects as they continue on this amazing journey across 100 years and more to really realise this proposition. It really, I guess, crystallised the importance of light and the textures and the materiality, and really understanding the intuitive nature of architecture by some of these really pivotal figures in architectural history. But equally, that legibility of the work of those really important pioneers in architecture around this high-tech idiom. And certainly the work of Foster and Rogers and Renzo Piano, where you really have that clarity and you can really understand elementally how these buildings come together. And sort of reflecting on some of these projects has been really important, because essentially this is architecture manifested in a manner in which we start to give expression to the complexities, but also work with all the elements and the skills that we have as practitioners. But equally at home, there are some really compelling architects. And I guess Fender Katsoulides to me have been really important figures in terms of how they've grappled with the Australian condition. also drawing upon the legacies of that multicultural dimension of architecture here in this country as well, drawing upon their own lineage and cultural connections as well, to really explore the possibilities of what architecture is in the Australian condition. And one, I guess, element that I'm not particularly interested in is architecture as spectacle. To me, architecture is really about meaning and what it actually provides in terms of the benefit to the human condition. And so while there is certainly some compelling formal sort of constitutions of architecture which really speaks to the spectacle, it hasn't really informed my mode of practice. But there was a pivotal moment in the sort of mid-90s where I met an architect actually working on this design competition here at Federation Square. And Catherine, who since became my wife, is also a co-founder of Greenaway Architects. And so these sliding door moments of how we start to progress through architecture, and these are the unsung heroes. And so it's really, I guess, there's a tension embedded in being put up on the stage and speaking to our practice without acknowledging those unsung heroes who really are the enablers for an architectural practice to evolve. And Catherine is equally compelling an architect as I am and has a really interesting story to tell. But there are some who are comfortable to speak within the public domain, and there are others who would rather have their eyes poked out with a sharp stick. But I've certainly been that sort of front of house guy speaking to our practice experience. But I guess the other dimension which has really inspired me has been some of the elder statesmen within architecture. And I was fortunate enough to participate in the Merkert International Masterclass a number of years back, and engaging with some significant figures in Australian architectural history, in Glenn Merkert and Rick LaPlastria and Britt Anderson and Lindsay Johnson and Peter Stutchbury. And they really sort of interrogated the idea of the essence of architecture, of how we engage with place, how we start to consider the skills and the capacity to really interrogate the idea and really push it to its logical conclusion. But there are other practitioners like Douglas Cardinal, a First Nations architect from Turtle Island, or Canada as it's better known. And again, a really pivotal and important figure in Indigenous architectural history. He's in his 90s now. I met up with him in Montreal a number of years back. I invited him to Australia to participate in a First Nations conference in Melbourne. And he really celebrated and embraced his culture. And he held up this flag to say that, well, everyone has the opportunity to really interrogate deeply their own cultural connection. And that has been a really important and significant marker in my architectural journey. And I've always said that architecture is inherently political. And to that end, I actually studied political science before I got into architecture. And I guess the journey into architecture was really circuitous in as much as I didn't actually go through the sort of linear path. I actually had a letter from my politics tutor as a letter of introduction to the Dean of Architecture at the University of Melbourne. And his name was Evan Walker, and unbeknownst to me, he was an architect. I knew him actually as a former Minister of Planning and former Minister of Aboriginal Affairs. And I knocked on his door and I said, I want to do architecture. And we spoke for an hour about everything except for architecture. And we spoke about politics, and we spoke about urban planning, and we spoke about the dimensions of how we can contribute to the considerations and the needs of society. And Australia has not reconciled with its Indigenous history. And there are many difficult truths that we need to understand. And we've had some setbacks, most recently in the referendum last year. But importantly, there is an opportunity and there is now an embrace and there's a hunger to engage with Indigenous culture within the built and natural environment. And we are starting to move in the right direction, and I'm very optimistic around the opportunity of working together collaboratively. And another significant moment was meeting Ruben Berg, who's a Gunditjmara man and graduate of architecture. And we got speaking. We realised at that time there was only 2 Indigenous practitioners in the entire state of Victoria that we knew of. And so this coalesced into the creation of Indigenous Architecture Victoria, the only peak body representing Indigenous practitioners in the built and natural environment. And so we went on a journey together to really bring together and give voice to the voiceless and start to provide opportunities and pathways into design schools. And inscribed across this continent are places of great meaning, but they are also politically contested. So if we look at places like the Budgebin cultural landscape about 3.5 hours southwest of here, where you see permanent settlements of Indigenous people that predate the pyramids, estimated to be 6,600 years old. And these are only now being revealed by the terrific work of traditional owners, elders and knowledge keepers. But we see across the globe, when we start to reveal those layers, we start to hit up against modernity, and we have really a contested and fractious relationship between that sort of palimpsest of layers of meaning around our cities and places. And one thing that I'm really, committed to is start to move beyond the muralisation of culture, where we cloak architecture rather than interrogate the opportunity to manifest it through spatial considerations and start to encode meaning in terms of the very essence of architecture, in terms of how we think about the opportunity of inscribing and connecting to over 67,000 years of continuous connection to this place. And in 2020, with Tristan Wong, we were fortunate enough to be selected as the creative directors for the Venice Architecture Biennale. And this was about really a point in time to interrogate how practitioners in Australia are navigating with the complexities and sensibilities of engaging with Indigenous culture across this continent. And so we showcased a series of projects to really unpack this idea thematically of how we live together and starting to learn from those deep connections. And coming back to this idea of Indigenous architecture as being inherently political, it really, crystallises the challenge to hold a mirror up to our society and ask the question, are we actually reflecting the full diversity of our community? And are we actually giving voice and agency and supporting reciprocity and mutual benefit for the custodians of country? And the other element that has really inspired me is notions of time. And I really start to think about how we start to go deeper. And so you can see here across the bottom is a sort of a graphic representation of the experience in the Australian continent. And so you can see right there on the end is that little red line. And that is the colonial experience against this deeper time of over 6,000 generations of continuous connection. And so part of our work is really starting to unpack and understand that there are many stories to tell. And I often say that you can concrete over country, but country still exists. The stories still reside in place. And it's for us to really encode that meaning and explore and unpack those stories through narrative and conversations and connections to those who have those stories. And this diagram here, really well encapsulates this notion of circular time and Indigenous conceptions of time, where we start to think about moon phases and seasonality and heartbeats, rather than the sort of, traditional understanding of the sort of linear progression through time. And so we often talk about past, present, and future as coexisting simultaneously. And this, to me, really informs, the interrogation of how we start to understand our responsibilities and obligations as practitioners. And I'm very interested in how we start to embrace an unashamedly contemporary reimagining of culture. And so this work, for instance, by Marie Clark, interrogates the idea of the eel trap, but repurposing and refashioning it in glass as opposed to the traditional, pandanus or the lamandra, which is woven to create these artefacts for cultural purposes. So it really is, a call to consider how we start to use the contemporary techniques and start to bring some of the deep histories and connections, and that collision is where the innovation starts to happen. And this idea of the patina of time is something that I'm also equally compelled by, and how materials age and how we start to understand the textures and the way in which materials age and evolve over time. And I guess this is in part why I've been sort of drawn by the brutalist tradition, where you do have that honesty, but you certainly see the way in which the material changes and how we have things like, the concrete cancer, and it starts to speak to us and tell us how that material is evolving with the conditions, particularly around the changing environments. But also how we adaptively reuse and repurpose some of those artefacts of architecture. And here we see on the right-hand side the office of Ricardo Bofill in Barcelona, which is repurposed as a cement factory, which actually became essentially their office, but also a compound for their entire family to reside within these silos. And also understanding, is there an opportunity to repurpose structures? And so the first time I looked at the Eiffel Tower and understood the history around how that was actually supposed to be demountable and pulled down after an exposition, but it's still there intact. But it has that opportunity, and we've always strived for this consideration of how we can start to really consider the notions of disassembly as well. And the other element, which is really core to my being, is this idea of design equity. And how do we actually support opportunities for those who have been marginalised about an opportunity and a pathway into architecture? And so certainly coming from humble beginnings, it's really important to reflect around the opportunities of how we can start to support lateral pathways into architecture. And having been involved as an architectural educator for 25 years, it is a sense of responsibility and obligation to give back. And so seeing projects like RSHP's Maggie Centre, again, it really speaks to the humility and the understanding of something doesn't need to be a massive artefact and edifice. It can actually be quite humble in terms of its scale and its ambition. But what it does, and in this instance, is supporting cancer sufferers in a sort of an environment which really is conducive to well-being and health. And so, while this is a Sterling Prize winner, it is really small in scale. Equally, when we went on this study tour in Barcelona, this particular project really resonated with me and started to change the trajectory of our practice to really think about the urban condition and the responsibility of the spaces between the built form, and starting to think about that landscape and urban design dimension around the capacity of architects to feed into these considerations as well. And similarly here, the work of 3XN with a high school, a local high school. It's not an elite school. So again, that sort of democratisation of architecture and understanding that excellence can actually be afforded to those who need it most, which is the mainstream populace rather than the elite. And similarly, understanding the opportunity to showcase our culture, to celebrate and amplify it as a really important part of the human experience. And so Bernard Tashumi's Parthenon Museum is, again, a really important project in terms of politically what it's saying, sitting in direct parallel to the Acropolis. And similarly, we look at the work here of Alvaro Siza in Portugal and how we start to nestle in to the landscape and start to not dominate but start to have a dialogue in harmony with nature. But also understanding that everyone should have the capacity to engage with good architecture, and it actually provides benefit to human beings in terms of how we showcase and understand the landscape. But also knowing too that the urban sprawl is ever magnifying, and we really start to need to understand the acute existential challenges that we are now confronting as practitioners. And we should certainly be part of the problem, so part of the solution rather than the problem, and start to use our skills for the benefits of community, particularly in light of some of these really challenging dimensions around biodiversity loss and the conditions around climate change. And certainly these are the real important things that we all should embrace as practitioners in the built and natural environment. So I'll leave you with an anecdote. I was walking through the Shoalhaven River with a senior Yuin elder, Uncle Max Dalamannaman Harrison. And he was showing his country to us as part of the Merkit Masterclass. And he said something quite profound. He said, "You've got to give it away to keep it." And what he was saying was the importance of passing on and sharing knowledge. Otherwise it can become lost. And knowing that Indigenous people have always been part of this oral tradition of passing on knowledge through story and narrative, it's an imperative that we actually pass on that knowledge. In the same way as when we think about when a senior elder passes away, it's often said that a whole library is burnt to the ground. So it's really important to have these conversations, these dialogues, to pass on that knowledge, to tell those stories, and to really engage with some of these, personal, introspective opportunities. And to that end, I'll say, Murray Yannia, go well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jefa, for the amazing talk. Really enjoyed it. There are so many deep topics to talk about, and with many of them, I wonder how to embrace, be more than so. It is political, as you say, architecture, but kind of being more aware and trying to push those old values that you shared with us, that you passed to us today. How can those values be more embraced in let's say regular architectural offices?
Well, it really starts with our architectural training. So we're all taught within the Western canon of architecture by and large. And when I went through architecture school, the word Indigenous, First Nations, Aboriginal was not mentioned once in any subject that I ever undertook. And so starting to broaden the frame of reference of how we embrace the complexity, the diversity of architectural understanding. There is no word for architecture in any Aboriginal language in this island continent that I know of the over 270 language groups and 600 dialects. There are words for making. There are words for shelter. But the poetics of that sort of intersection between craft and art and architecture and country, as we would define it, or place, is inscribed with so many layers of meaning. And I think it's beholden on us to actually interrogate that as part of our learning journey. And we're all on a spectrum of learning. And I think there is great wisdom in 67,000 years of continuous connection to this place. And so to that end, I think there is an opportunity to broaden the conversation. And what I'm certainly seeing in recent times in the Australian experience is this is now starting to be embedded in our schools of architecture. These conversations are starting to be had. And I'm seeing it through the students and graduates who are coming into architectural practices who are asking the question, are we engaging properly? Are we speaking to the right people? Are we thinking about our responsibility to the planet? Are we being respectful to the context that we're working within? So I'm really optimistic. I think things are shifting. I think there's room for optimism, particularly in terms of the younger generation, because they're hungry, they're engaged, and they're really demanding us to engage with some of these conversations.
And what about the time might be a little bit tight as the talk was a bit longer. But what that will be for the next generation. But what about the already established architecture practices? What can they do to support that change, to be more conscious on?
Well, I think the first thing is to have skin in the game. There are, as best as we can determine, maybe 20 registered Indigenous architects in the entire country. So if the starting point is to hit up an Indigenous architect, we're going to fall over because we're going to be overwhelmed by the demand. So it's really about actually coming to the table prepared and building one's own cultural intelligence. So it actually requires an investment in time and effort to actually build one's own capacity. And I think that becomes the vehicle to open up one's opportunities. And what I've found, if we start to shift the mindset from a transactional to a relational model, we benefit greatly, because it starts to move beyond a sort of a compliance-driven mindset to one where you're actually invested in a values alignment to the importance and the benefit of actually engaging with some of these considerations.
Yeah. Actually, you say that that the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations align with Indigenous values. What will you, if you have to list values that should be included in good architecture, which words will you use?
Well, I think there's a critical piece now where we actually have to repair, remediate and restore country, because it is in a degraded state. So it's really beholden on us to actually use all of our skills to unlock the potential of what architecture can do to actually fix up the mess that we've got ourselves into. And it starts really with a deeper interrogation of what we're actually doing. Sometimes it's actually better to build nothing. Sometimes it's actually better to build a community or to build a dialogue or to build a system to enable community to flourish. It's not always about the artifact. It's really about being very considered in terms of what we actually engage with, because ultimately we're on a pathway and a trajectory which, you know, we're kind of hitting a tipping point. And I think there is importance around the learnings of Indigenous people. And I use the metaphor of the scar tree. When you remove the bark to make something like a canoe, you would never cut down the tree to remove that bark to make a canoe. You only remove that which you need. The tree remains intact. It provides shelter. You can harvest further material like the sap for medicinal purposes. You can harvest more material later on. It still provides shelter and shade. But it also speaks to notions of time, because over time, the scar which is evident in the removal of that material grows back together. So it actually speaks to notions of time. And to me, this is really a reinforcement of the ecological practices of First Nations people. And I remember hearing a statistic through United Nations which said something like, some ridiculous figure, like 67% of the world's natural ecosystems are being protected by 2% of the population being the First Nations custodians, like in the Amazon, for instance. So in a way, we're actually doing a disproportionate amount of work to actually protect our environment. So we all actually have to galvanise and come together and use our capacities to actually remedy the situations that we're often in, and using architecture as a tool. And it has been complicit in the colonial story, which has actually been extractive and has removed landscapes and degraded landscapes and the like. But ultimately, now we actually have the capacity to use it for good.
Thank you, Jefa, for the talk and for the conversation. We'll continue later with a roundtable discussion. But for now, thank you a lot for the nice conversation. Thank you.